I am Nathaniel, 71 years old, and a ghost in what is supposed to be my own family. I was sitting quietly in the living room watching my favorite jazz concert on television when my daughter-in-law marched in. She snatched the remote from my hand, shut the screen off, and looked down at me with absolute disgust. "No one in my house watches that trash," she snapped. My own son, sitting just feet away, said absolutely nothing. I did not yell, I did not argue, I just smiled, walked back to my room, and made a single move that erased the fake wealthy life she loved to flaunt. The next morning she was banging on my door in a panic. But before I tell you exactly how I ruined her perfect illusion, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a lesson they will never forget. The jazz music was playing softly. It was an old recording from the 1970s, the kind of music my late wife Vivian used to play on Sunday mornings when we were just starting out in Chicago. For a few minutes sitting in the corner of that massive living room, I felt at peace. I was invisible, which was exactly how my son Derek and his wife Chloe preferred me to be. Then I heard the sharp click of her designer heels on the hardwood floor. Chloe walked into the room. She was 32 years old, dressed in an expensive silk blouse and tailored trousers, radiating an unearned sense of superiority. She did not say good evening. She did not even acknowledge me as a human being. She simply walked over to the coffee table, picked up the remote, and pressed the power button. The screen went black. The beautiful saxophone solo was cut off instantly, leaving a heavy and suffocating silence in the room. I looked up at her. She was staring at me with a cold and hard expression. Her lips were curled into a slight sneer. "No one in my house watches that trash," she said. Her voice was sharp and deliberately designed to humiliate me. "It ruins the aesthetic of the room. If you want to listen to that noise, use headphones in your own space." I slowly turned my head to look at my son. Derek was 39 years old, a vice president at a logistics firm. I had worked 18-hour shifts on dangerous construction sites to pay for the degree that got him that title. He was sitting on the expensive leather sofa just 10 feet away. He heard every single word. He saw everything. But my son did not look up. He kept his eyes glued to his smartphone, swiping through his screen as if the floor was the most fascinating thing in the entire world. He was a coward, completely terrified of upsetting his white wife, who constantly reminded him that she came from the prestigious Sterling family. I felt a cold realization wash over me. The boy I had raised to be a strong and respectful man was gone. In his place sat a stranger who allowed his wife to treat his own father like a stray dog they had reluctantly taken in from the rain. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand respect. Respect is something you command, not something you beg for. I simply nodded, pushed myself up from the armchair, and walked away. I walked down the long and brightly lit hallway toward the back of the house. Chloe loved to host dinner parties and brag to her wealthy friends about this $2 million mansion. She loved to show off the marble countertops, the crystal chandeliers, and the heated swimming pool. She loved to casually mention how hard she and Derek had worked to afford such luxury in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the state. And then there was my room. They had put me in a small and windowless guest room on the ground floor right next to the laundry area. It was cramped, smelled faintly of bleach, and had the cheapest mattress they could find. To Chloe, I was the embarrassing secret they had to hide when company came over. I was the broke and senile black father-in-law who survived on a meager pension, wearing faded flannel shirts and scuffed work boots. She thought I was a burden. She thought I was entirely dependent on their charity. What Chloe did not know, and what Derek had conveniently chosen to forget, was that I did not need their charity. For 40 years, I ran the most successful electrical contracting business in the city. I built skyscrapers. I wired entire commercial districts. When Vivian passed away, I sold the company and quietly retired. I had enough money to buy their entire neighborhood twice over. I moved into their cramped guest room and put on the mask of a poor and struggling old man for one specific reason. I wanted to see who my son had truly become. I wanted to see the real character of the woman he married. When you have money, people show you their absolute best behavior. When they think you have nothing, they show you their true soul. And Chloe had an ugly and rotten soul. I entered my room and quietly closed the door. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and reached under the mattress. I pulled out an old and battered laptop bag. Inside was a thick and outdated computer that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. I opened it and waited for the screen to light up. To the outside world, I was a man who barely knew how to use a smartphone. But behind this screen, I was the sole manager of the Rollins Family Trust. I logged into my private banking portal. The screen loaded, displaying a string of numbers that would have made Chloe faint, but I was not interested in my main accounts tonight. I navigated to a specific subsidiary account. For the past 3 years, Derek and Chloe had been living a lifestyle they absolutely could not afford. Derek made a good salary, but it was nowhere near enough to maintain a $2 million mansion, 2 luxury vehicles, frequent international vacations, and the endless shopping sprees Chloe required to impress her friends. To keep them from going bankrupt, I had secretly set up an automatic payment system through my trust. I clicked on the credit card management tab. There it was, the Platinum account. The exact card Chloe used every single day to maintain her elite status in her social circle. She thought Derek was paying the $10,000 monthly balance. Derek thought his annual corporate bonuses were covering it. Neither of them realized that the invisible old man living in their laundry room was the only reason they were not living on the street. I looked at the recent transactions. $500 at a high-end hair salon, $2,000 for a designer handbag, and a pending charge of $5,000 to a luxury catering company for a high society gala she was hosting this coming weekend. She called my music trash. She called this her house. I moved the cursor over the account settings. My hand did not hesitate for a single second. I clicked on the button labeled Freeze Account. A confirmation prompt popped up on the screen. I clicked Yes. Then, just to be extremely thorough, I selected the option to report the card as stolen and requested an immediate block on all pending transactions. The banking system processed the request in seconds. The $5,000 catering deposit was instantly flagged and permanently declined. I closed the laptop and put it back under the mattress. I lay down on the cheap bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. Tomorrow morning, Chloe was going to wake up to a very different reality. She was going to step out into the real world and discover that her endless supply of free money had just dried up. The financial safety net I had woven for my son was officially cut. The music had stopped for me tonight. But the real show was about to begin for them. 6 o'clock in the morning. The sun had not even crested the horizon, and the massive $2 million house was completely silent. Normally, my daughter-in-law Chloe did not wake up until 9. She preferred to sleep and order an expensive green juice delivery and spend her mornings lounging by the heated pool. But today was different. Today there was a frantic and heavy knocking at my bedroom door. I lay in my stiff, cheap bed for a moment, listening to the desperate sound. The knocking grew louder. "Nathaniel, are you awake?" Her voice filtered through the thin wood. It did not have the usual sharp and venomous tone from last night. It sounded shaky. It sounded panicked. I slowly pushed myself up, making sure to let my joints pop and crack. I put on my faded robe, shuffled across the small room, and opened the door. Chloe stood in the hallway. She looked absolutely miserable. Her expensive silk pajamas were wrinkled. Her hair, usually sprayed and styled to perfection, was tied in a messy knot. But it was her face that told the real story. She was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes were wide with a frantic energy. She forced the corners of her mouth up into something that resembled a smile, but it looked more like a grimace of pain. "Nathaniel." She began, her voice dripping with a fake sweetness that made my stomach turn. "I wanted to come down here and apologize for my behavior last night. I was out of line when I turned off your television program. I have just been under an enormous amount of pressure lately." I simply stared at her, maintaining the blank and slightly confused expression of a senile old man. Inside, my mind was sharp as a razor. I knew exactly why she was standing outside the laundry room at 6 in the morning. This had nothing to do with my jazz music. This had everything to do with the fact that her financial oxygen had just been cut off. Chloe was a woman desperately trying to fit into an elite circle of wealthy white women in Chicago. She needed to host the grandest parties, wear the newest designer labels, and project the image of a woman born into old money. Without that platinum card, she was nothing but a fraud wearing a cheap mask. She cleared her throat, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "You see, Nathaniel, I was up early trying to finalize some details for the charity gala I am hosting this weekend. I went to pay the $5,000 catering deposit, and there seems to be a strange issue with the platinum credit card. The bank automated system said the card was reported stolen and the account was frozen by the primary account holder. She looked at me, her eyes begging for an explanation. Years ago, when my son Derek first started struggling with his mortgage, I had given him that card. I told him it was a low-limit emergency fund from my modest savings. I knew Chloe had eventually hijacked it. She assumed Derek was quietly paying the massive bills. She never realized that the primary name on the account, the only person with the legal authority to freeze or unfreeze the funds, was the old black man she treated like garbage. Until today. I widened my eyes and let my hands tremble slightly. I reached up and scratched my head, playing the role of a confused and terrified grandfather. "Oh my," I mumbled, keeping my voice frail and uneven. "Stolen, you say?" "Well, I went to the grocery store yesterday afternoon to buy some apples. I could not find my old leather wallet when I got back. I got so scared that someone would steal my meager pension money, so I called the number on the back of a receipt and told the bank to freeze everything. I am so sorry, Chloe. My memory just is not what it used to be." The color completely drained from her face. I could see the exact moment her heart dropped into her stomach. "You froze the account," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Nathaniel, I need that caterer secured by 8 o'clock this morning. If I do not pay the deposit, they will cancel. All of my friends are coming to this gala. The mayor is coming. I will be a laughingstock. You have to call the bank right now and unfreeze it." I shook my head slowly and looked down at my slippers. "I cannot do that, Chloe. The bank does not open until 9, and honestly, I do not even remember the security password they asked me for. Derek will have to help me figure it out this evening when he gets home from work. I am just so terribly confused this morning." She stared at me, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might shatter. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hurl insults at me. But she could not, because right now the poor senile old man in the laundry room held the keys to her entire social existence. She took a deep, shuddering breath, turned around, and walked heavily down the hallway. Her designer heels did not click with authority anymore. They dragged with defeat. I waited until I heard her footsteps disappear up the main staircase. I gently closed my door. The moment the latch clicked, the frail and confused old man vanished. My posture straightened. My hands stopped trembling. The performance was over, and it was time to get back to work. I walked over to the bed, reached under the cheap mattress, and pulled out my heavy laptop. I opened it and quickly bypassed the security protocols to access the Rollins Family Trust portal. I needed to see exactly how much damage Chloe had been doing before I froze the account. I pulled up the detailed transaction history for the Platinum card. I scrolled past the $5,000 decline charge. I scrolled past the luxury shoe stores, the high-end salons, and the expensive brunch receipts. But then my eyes locked onto a transaction that had successfully cleared just 2 days ago. It was not for designer clothes. It was not for an expensive dinner. It was a charge for exactly $10,000. The merchant name listed on the statement was Sunny Pines Medical. I sat frozen on the edge of the bed. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark room. Sunny Pines Medical was not a country club. It was not a luxury spa. I knew exactly what that place was. Decades ago, my electrical contracting company had actually wired the security systems for that exact building. It was a highly exclusive, privately owned psychiatric facility located just outside the city limits. It was a place where wealthy families quietly locked away their inconvenient relatives. My mind raced, connecting the dots with terrifying speed. A $10,000 payment, a high-security psychiatric clinic, a daughter-in-law who desperately wanted me out of her $2 million house. Chloe was not just spending my money to maintain her fake wealthy lifestyle. She was using my own money to finance a plan to have me declared mentally incompetent and locked away in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life. She wanted me institutionalized. She wanted me heavily medicated and hidden away so she would never have to look at me again. And based on that transaction, my own son, Derek the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was likely fully aware of the plan. He was going to let his wife throw his father into a mental asylum just so they could keep up their miserable charade of a perfect elite life. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old man whose mind was slipping away. They thought they could easily erase me from their home and steal whatever small pension they thought I had left. But as I stared at the glowing transaction on the screen, a cold and dangerous smile spread across my face. They had no idea that they had just declared war on a man who owned the very ground they walked on. By 6 o'clock that evening, The massive house was filled with the smell of expensive roasted lamb and the suffocating scent of desperation. Chloe had spent the entire afternoon frantically pacing the hallways, dialing the bank over and over again. But without my direct authorization, she was completely locked out of her favorite platinum lifeline. She was a nervous wreck because her parents Richard and Susan Sterling were coming to dinner. The Sterlings were the kind of people who believed their last name was a royal title. They considered themselves the absolute peak of high society, even though Richard had simply made his money in a regional car dealership chain. To them, my son Derek was just a lucky charity case who got to marry into their pristine bloodline. They tolerated him, but they never respected him. And they certainly had no respect for me. At 6:30, the door to my small room flew open without a knock. Chloe stood in the doorway wearing a tight cocktail dress and clutching a silver tray. On the tray was a small cold plate of leftover food. She shoved the tray onto my nightstand with a loud clatter. "You are eating in the kitchen tonight," she said, not even bothering to look me in the eye. Or better yet, just stay hidden in this room. My parents are expecting an elegant evening, Nathaniel. Your eating habits, your worn-out clothes, and your whole demeanor just do not fit the Sterling family culture. It is embarrassing enough that we have to house you. I do not need my mother losing her appetite just by looking at you." I looked at the cold slab of meat on the plate. 40 years ago, when I was running construction crews across Chicago, I would have thrown that tray out the window and kicked her out of my house. But today, I simply nodded, making sure to keep my hands shaking just a little bit to maintain the illusion of a frail old man. "Of course, Chloe," I muttered softly. "I would not want to ruin your special dinner. I will stay out of the way." She rolled her eyes, let out an exasperated sigh, and slammed the door shut. I waited 10 minutes in the silence of my room. Then I quietly slipped out and walked down the dark hallway toward the kitchen. The kitchen connected directly to the formal dining room, separated only by a heavy oak door that Chloe had left cracked open by an inch. It was the absolute perfect listening post. I stood in the shadows, perfectly still. I heard the doorbell ring, followed by the loud and booming voice of Richard Sterling and the high-pitched fake laughter of his wife Susan. I heard Derek greeting them. My son sounded eager, pitching his voice up, sounding pathetic and desperate to please. They moved into the dining room. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses echoed through the crack in the door. I listened as Richard dominated the entire conversation. He bragged endlessly about a recent vacation to Italy and complained about the property taxes on his new boat. Derek agreed with every single word the man said. My son sounded like a trained parrot desperate for a crumb of validation from a man who secretly despised him. Then the conversation shifted. I could hear the rising tension in Chloe's voice. She tried to casually mention that she might need a temporary cash loan from her father because of a sudden banking error on her credit card. Richard scoffed loudly. "A banking error," he demanded, his voice thick with condescension. "Or is your husband simply failing to provide the lifestyle you deserve?" I listened to Derek scramble to defend himself. He stammered apologies, promising that the finances were completely under control. He was sweating. I could hear the absolute terror in his voice. He was terrified of losing his in-laws' approval. Then came the words that froze the blood in my veins. Richard slapped his hand down on the heavy wooden table. "Let us stop pretending, Derek." Richard said, his voice dropping into a harsh and commanding tone. "I am tired of seeing my daughter stressed over your financial burdens. How is the legal paperwork coming along? What is the status of the power of attorney for that old black man living in your laundry room?" I stopped breathing. I pressed my ear closer to the crack in the oak door. Chloe chimed in, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "Daddy is right, Derek. I cannot take it anymore. The smell of his cheap lotion, the way he shuffles around my house. It is disgusting. You promised me we would be done with him by the end of the month." Richard grunted in agreement. "Listen to me, boy," Richard told my son. "Once you get him to sign away his medical and financial rights, you get rid of him. Put him in a state facility where he belongs. My daughter cannot live with such a filthy person under the same roof. It is dragging down our family image." I stood in the dark kitchen and waited for the explosion. I waited for my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had taught to stand tall and be proud of his heritage, to rise from his chair. I waited for Derek to defend his father. I waited for him to defend his own flesh and blood against these arrogant and racist people. I waited for him to throw them out of the house. Instead, the dining room was completely quiet for a few agonizing seconds. Then I heard Derek speak. His voice was calm, submissive, and completely devoid of any loyalty. "It will be done by next week, sir," Derek said. "I have the papers drawn up. We are just waiting for the right moment to make him sign. He is getting more confused every day. It will not be a problem. I will have him out of the house and out of our hair before the holidays. You have my word." The clinking of glasses resumed. They actually toasted. They raised their expensive wine glasses and toasted to my demise. I stood in the dark kitchen surrounded by the shadows and felt something inside me finally snap. The last remaining shred of hope I had for my son evaporated into the cold air. He was not a victim of a manipulative wife. He was an active and willing participant. He was selling his own father to the slaughterhouse just to keep his place at a white man's table. I did not shed a tear. Tears are for the weak, and I was far from weak. The paternal love I held for Derek died right there on the kitchen floor, replaced by a cold and calculating fury. I silently backed away from the door and retreated to my room. Derek thought he was a few days away from taking over my life. He thought he was playing a master game of chess against a senile old fool. But he was about to learn a very painful lesson. A man who builds skyscrapers knows exactly which support beams to kick out to make the entire structure collapse. Tomorrow they were all leaving the house for work. And tomorrow I was going to crack open my son's darkest secrets, because I knew exactly where he kept his hidden safe, and I knew exactly how to break it wide open. At 8 o'clock the next morning, the heavy mahogany front door slammed shut. I stood perfectly still in my dark room listening to the muffled sounds of the driveway. The heavy rumble of Derek's luxury SUV started up, followed closely by the high-pitched whine of Chloe's imported sports car. I listened as the tires crunched against the gravel, the engines fading into the distance as they headed off to their respective jobs. They were gone. The massive $2 million house was completely empty, leaving me in absolute silence. I sat on the edge of my cheap mattress and took a slow and deep breath. I rolled my shoulders back, letting the stiffness leave my body. I stopped slumping. I stopped shaking. The frail old man was put away for the day, and Nathaniel Rollins, the man who built half the commercial grid of downtown Chicago, stepped out of the laundry room. I walked up the main staircase, my footsteps silent on the plush carpet. I headed straight for the east wing of the house where Derek kept his home office. He always kept the door locked, assuming that a simple brass deadbolt was enough to keep his senile father out. It was almost insulting. During my 40 years in the construction business, I had overseen the installation of bank vaults and high-security corporate data centers. A residential interior lock was a joke. I slid a thin piece of rigid plastic from my pocket, slipped it between the door frame and the strike plate, applied a little pressure, and the door clicked open in less than 3 seconds. I stepped into my son's office. It was decorated exactly how a man pretending to be important would design a room. Dark oak furniture, expensive leather chairs that had never been sat in, and shelves lined with thick books on investing that looked like they had never been opened. Derek loved the illusion of wealth. He loved looking like a self-made titan of industry. I walked directly to the large, abstract painting hanging behind his desk. He thought he was being clever, hiding his safe behind a piece of art just like in the movies. I lifted the painting off the wall and set it gently on the floor. Embedded in the drywall was a digital keypad safe. It was a commercial brand, expensive to the average consumer, but structurally pathetic to anyone who understood mechanics. Derek relied on a 6-digit electronic code. I relied on physics. From my jacket pocket, I pulled out a small and incredibly powerful rare earth magnet and a flat steel tension tool. I placed the magnet on the top right corner of the steel door exactly over the internal solenoid lock. I pressed the tension tool into the key bypass slot, applied a sharp twist, and the magnetic pull lifted the locking pin completely out of place. The heavy steel door swung open with a soft metallic groan. It took me less than 30 seconds. I reached inside the dark steel box. It was packed with thick manila folders and legal envelopes. I pulled the entire stack out and laid it on the pristine surface of his oak desk. It was time to see exactly how deep my son had buried himself. The first folder I opened contained the legal paperwork Richard Sterling had mentioned during the dinner party. It was a comprehensive power of attorney document. It gave Derek total and unconditional control over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions. I looked at the bottom of the last page. There was my signature, Nathaniel Rollins. I leaned in closer, studying the ink. It was a forgery, and quite frankly, a sloppy one. Someone had practiced tracing my name, but they missed the heavy pressure I always applied on the letter N. It was good enough to fool an overworked clerk at a suburban bank branch, but a handwriting expert would tear it apart in 10 seconds. Derek was preparing to legally erase my autonomy. I set the fake document aside and opened the next envelope. This was the one that made me pause. It was a loan agreement from a private equity lending firm in the city. The kind of firm that operates just barely within the boundaries of the law, dealing in high-risk predatory loans with massive interest rates. I scanned the numbers. My son had taken out a loan for $500,000. I dug deeper into the pile, pulling out a stack of financial statements from an online brokerage account. As I flipped through the pages, the pathetic reality of Derek's life painted a very clear picture. He had not used that $500,000 to start a business or make a solid investment. He had been day trading. He had been gambling on highly volatile tech stocks, trying to make millions overnight to keep up with the absurd lifestyle his wife demanded. The statements showed a bloodbath of red numbers, margin calls, liquidated assets, total losses. He had blown all $500,000 in less than 6 months. His account balance was zero. Then I found the letters from the mortgage company, final notices, intent to accelerate. The mansion, the very house Chloe paraded around in like a queen, was 3 months behind on payments. They were weeks away from the bank foreclosing on the property and changing the locks. Derek was drowning. His corporate salary could barely cover the interest on his predatory loan, let alone the mortgage and Chloe's massive credit card bills. He was living on borrowed time, terrified of the day his wealthy in-laws and his demanding wife found out he was completely broke. That was why he was so desperate. That was why he needed to get rid of me. I was his final payday. I felt a mixture of profound disgust and cold pity. I had given him every opportunity, and he had thrown it all away for the illusion of status. But it was the very last folder at the bottom of the safe that turned my disgust into a lethal and unforgiving rage. It was a thick yellow medical file. The logo on the top read Sunny Pines Medical. I opened it and saw my own name printed on the patient profile. I began to read the pages. It was a complete fabricated psychological evaluation. It detailed episodes of severe memory loss, violent outbursts, and an inability to recognize family members. At the end of the report, a doctor I had never met had signed a diagnosis declaring me a danger to myself and officially suffering from advanced stage dementia. They were not just going to throw me in a home. They had engineered a complete medical execution of my mind. I flipped to the last page in the folder to see what this fake diagnosis was attached to. It was a commercial real estate appraisal for a piece of property. 10 acres of undeveloped prime suburban land located on the north side of the city. My breath caught in my throat. That land belonged to Vivian. My beautiful wife had bought those 10 acres over 40 years ago with her first savings from her bakery. She loved the ancient oak trees on that property. She used to tell me that one day we would build a small cabin there and listen to the wind rustle through the leaves. When she passed away, she left the deed solely in my name. It was the only piece of the world that still felt completely connected to her spirit. Derek had an appraisal done. A commercial developer was willing to pay $1.2 million to bulldoze Vivian's trees and build a shopping center. But because the land was in my name, Derek could not sell it. Unless, of course, he had a forged power of attorney and a medical document proving his father was a senile lunatic. He was going to lock me in a psychiatric ward, drug me into silence, and pave over his own mother's sacred sanctuary just to pay off the massive gambling debt he was too cowardly to admit to his wife. I stood in the silent office staring at the papers. My hands were no longer shaking. My heart was beating with a slow and terrifying calm. Any lingering hesitation, any small shred of fatherly mercy I had left in my soul vanished completely. They had crossed the final boundary. They had brought Vivian into their filthy scheme. I carefully stacked the papers, placed them back in the folder, and returned everything to the safe exactly as I had found it. I closed the heavy steel door. I removed the magnet and the tension tool, and the lock clicked back into place, securing their terrible secrets in the dark. I hung the abstract painting perfectly back on the wall. I walked out of the office and pulled the door shut, locking it behind me. I walked down the stairs feeling a new and absolute clarity. Derek and Chloe thought they were brilliant architects constructing a masterpiece of fraud. But they forgot one fundamental rule of the world. You never try to drop a building on the man who taught you how to pour the concrete. I went back to my room and sat in the dark. I knew their next move. With the medical paperwork drafted, they just needed to legitimize the diagnosis. They needed a witness. They needed a performance. and I was going to give them the greatest performance of their miserable lives. 2 days later, the trap was finally set. The massive house was quiet. Derek was at work, leaving Chloe to execute the next phase of their miserable plan. I was sitting in my worn armchair in the living room, staring blankly at the wall, playing the part of the empty shell they wanted me to be. Then I heard the click of her designer heels. Chloe walked into the room, accompanied by a tall man wearing a pristine white lab coat. She had that same fake, sweet smile plastered across her face, a smile that made my blood boil. "Nathaniel," she said, loudly, speaking slowly as if I were a deaf toddler. "I brought a friend of the family to see you today. This is Dr. Evans. He is here to do a routine wellness check. We just want to make sure your memory and your health are doing okay." I looked at the man standing beside her. He had the white coat and a stethoscope draped around his neck. But my eyes did not stop there. 40 years of running large-scale construction sites taught me how to spot a con artist from 50 yards away. A real medical professional carries a certain exhaustion, a specific weight on their shoulders from dealing with human life. This man stood too rigidly. His lab coat still had the stiff vertical creases from being freshly taken out of a cheap plastic package. And most importantly, I looked at his shoes. Real doctors who stand on their feet for 12-hour shifts wear supportive and comfortable footwear. This man was wearing cheap, flashy leather loafers that looked completely absurd in a medical context. He was not a doctor. He was a hired actor. He was probably a small-time grifter Chloe found desperate enough to play along for some quick cash. I gave him a slow, confused nod, letting my jaw go slightly slack. Dr. Evans sat down in the chair opposite mine. He pulled out a clipboard with a stack of official-looking papers. He did not ask about my heart rate. He did not check my pulse or my breathing. He went straight for the mental evaluation. "Hello, Nathaniel," he said in a slow, patronizing tone. "I am going to ask you a few simple questions today. Do not worry if you cannot remember. Just try your best. Can you tell me what day of the week it is?" I decided right then to give them the greatest performance of my entire life. I stared past him at the blank wall, blinking slowly and deliberately. "Tuesday," I mumbled, keeping my voice weak and raspy. It was actually Thursday. Chloe let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She looked at the fake doctor and shook her head tragically, putting her hand over her heart. Dr. Evans scribbled something furiously on his clipboard. "Okay, Nathaniel, let us try another one. Can you tell me the name of the current president?" I pretended to struggle. I furrowed my brow. I let my hands start to tremble violently, resting them on my knees so they could clearly see the shaking. I mumbled the name of a president from 20 years ago, adding a slight stutter to my voice. Then the con man tried his little parlor trick. He took off his expensive-looking watch and placed it on the coffee table right in front of me. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I stumbled on the numbers, intentionally mixing them up and stopping at 80. While I was pretending to be deeply frustrated and confused, he subtly slid his watch off the table and dropped it smoothly into his lab coat pocket. "Nathaniel," he said softly, leaning forward, "do you remember where I just put my watch?" I looked at the empty coffee table. I widened my eyes in fake panic. I looked under my chair, checking my own pockets with frantic, trembling hands. It was right there. I whispered, my voice shaking with engineered fear. Did someone take it? "Are people coming into the house to steal my things?" Chloe covered her mouth, pretending to hold back a sob. "It is getting worse," she whispered to the fake doctor, her voice dripping with fake sorrow. "He hides things and then thinks people are stealing from him. He forgets who I am. It is terrifying for us to live like this. We do not know what he might do next." I watched her performance and felt a cold knot of absolute disgust in my stomach. She was laying the groundwork perfectly. She was building the exact narrative that I was not just forgetful, but dangerously paranoid and completely detached from reality. This was exactly what a judge would need to hear to grant an involuntary psychiatric hold. Dr. Evans placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I understand, Chloe," he said smoothly. "Dementia is a cruel and unforgiving disease. It takes the person you love and replaces them with a paranoid stranger. It is simply not safe for him to be without 24-hour secure supervision. I will finalize the medical report today. You are doing the right thing for him by seeking residential care." They both stood up. The fake doctor packed up his clipboard. They did not even bother to say goodbye to me. They treated me exactly like a broken piece of furniture that was about to be thrown out with the morning garbage. They walked out of the living room and headed down the long hallway toward the front foyer. I waited until they were completely out of sight. Then the trembling in my hands stopped instantly. My posture straightened. The confused fog in my eyes cleared completely. During my years negotiating brutal electrical contracts with cutthroat developers in Chicago, I learned one very important rule. You never walk into a room without a way to record verbal promises. People lie, ink fades, but audio is forever. Before Chloe had walked into the room, I had slid my favorite heavy black pen into the front pocket of my faded flannel shirt. It looked like a standard cheap ballpoint pen, but it was actually a high-definition digital audio recorder. I had pressed the activation button the moment I heard her footsteps. I quietly pushed myself out of the armchair. I walked softly down the hallway, stopping just before the corner that led to the foyer. I pressed my back against the wall, held my breath, and listened. I heard the distinct rustle of heavy paper. "Here is the rest of the payment," Chloe said, her voice dropping from a sweet whisper to a harsh and businesslike tone. $5,000 in cash, just like we agreed. You will have the signed medical evaluation delivered to me by tomorrow morning, right? I heard the fake doctor shuffle the bills, counting them quickly. "Yes, Mrs. Rollins. The paperwork will be absolutely airtight. It will state that he requires immediate institutionalization due to severe cognitive decline and violent paranoia. The court will not question a single word of it." "My signature looks extremely official. Just make sure it is backdated," Chloe demanded, her tone sharp and commanding. "And remember, if anyone ever asks, you have been treating him for the past 6 months." "Do not worry," the man replied smoothly, opening the front door. "I have done this a dozen times for wealthy families like yours. Enjoy your new peace of mind." The front door opened and closed heavily. I heard Chloe let out a sharp and nasty laugh of pure victory. I heard her walking toward the kitchen, probably to pour herself an expensive glass of wine to celebrate her brilliant and wicked scheme. I walked back to my room and closed the door silently. I pulled the black pen from my pocket and connected it via a hidden cable to my old laptop under the bed. I played the audio file back. The sound was crystal clear. Chloe handing over the cash, the fake doctor promising the fraudulent medical documents, her demanding the backdated dates to establish a fake medical history. It was a perfect and undeniable criminal confession. They thought they had just secured the final piece of the puzzle to lock me away and steal Vivian's land. They thought they had outsmarted a helpless and broken old man. They did not realize they had just handed a former Chicago contractor the exact leverage needed to completely destroy their entire world. My son and his wife were playing a very dangerous game. They were digging a massive grave, and tomorrow I was going to make sure they fell right into it. Chloe thought I was at the local park feeding the pigeons. She had actually handed me a stale piece of bread this morning and told me to stay out of the house for at least 4 hours because her expensive interior decorator was coming over to prepare for her upcoming charity gala. I smiled. My best confused smile took the bread and shuffled slowly down the long driveway. I did go to the park. I walked right through it and stepped into the back of a black luxury town car with tinted windows that was waiting for me on the other side. 30 minutes later, I was stepping out of a private executive elevator on the 50th floor of the most ruthless and expensive corporate law firm in downtown Chicago. The receptionist did not ask me for my name. She recognized me immediately despite my faded flannel shirt and my scuffed work boots. She stood up respectfully and led me straight down the marble hallway to the corner glass office. Standing behind a massive mahogany desk was Arthur Vance. Vance was a 60-year-old legal shark who had helped me navigate multi-million-dollar construction contracts and ruthless union negotiations for over 2 decades. He was a man who destroyed corporate rivals for breakfast. When I walked into his office, he did not see a frail and senile old man. He saw the boss. He poured 2 glasses of neat bourbon, pushed one across the heavy desk, and sat down. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I reached into my front pocket, pulled out the small black pen, and placed it on the polished wood. I connected it to his computer and pressed play. We sat in absolute silence as the high-definition audio filled the room. Vance listened to Chloe paying the fake doctor $5,000 in cash in the hallway of my own home. He heard her aggressively demanding a backdated and fraudulent medical diagnosis. He heard the entire twisted plot to lock me in a psychiatric facility just so she would not have to look at me anymore. Vance did not blink. His expression remained completely flat, but I could see the lethal calculation working behind his cold eyes. When the recording finished, Vance leaned back in his heavy leather chair and folded his hands. "They are moving much faster than we anticipated, Nate," he said in a low voice. This fake medical evaluation is dangerous, but it is a criminal act we can easily crush. However, we need to talk about the primary asset right now. We need to review the status of the house. This is the exact part of the story that my son Derek and his arrogant wife Chloe completely failed to understand. They loved parading around that $2 million mansion. Chloe loved posting pictures of the grand marble staircase on the internet, claiming she and Derek had built their dream life through their own hard work and elite breeding. She loved inviting her wealthy white friends over and looking down on me as I quietly cleaned the kitchen or stayed hidden in the basement laundry room. She truly believed she was the queen of a castle she had earned, but Chloe did not own a single brick of that house. 5 years ago, Derek was secretly drowning in massive credit card debt trying to impress Chloe before they got married. He was desperate to buy a house in that exclusive neighborhood to prove he belonged in her high society world. He came to me crying and begging for a loan because the banks had completely rejected his applications. I knew Chloe was a gold digger who would bleed him dry if he gave her the chance. So I made a very strategic business decision. I bought the mansion completely in cash. I purchased it through a blind, limited liability company called Rollins Holdings. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of that company. I let Derek and Chloe move in, but I made Derek sign an official and confidential lease agreement. That document allows him to rent the property from my company for exactly $1 a month. Chloe thought her husband was a self-made millionaire paying a massive mortgage. Derek let her believe that pathetic lie to feed his own fragile ego. And I let them both play house while I held the ultimate deed in a locked vault, waiting to see if my son would ever become a real man and tell his wife the truth. He never did. I looked at Vance and took a sip of the strong bourbon. The house is not the only problem, I told him. I cracked his hidden wall safe yesterday while they were at work. He owes $500,000 to a predatory private equity firm. He blew all of it on the stock market trying to get rich quick. And he has a forged power of attorney with my name on it sitting on his desk ready to file. He wants to use that fake dementia diagnosis to sell Vivian's 10 acres of land in the suburbs so he can cover his gambling debts without his wife finding out. Vance tightened his grip on his crystal glass. He was silent for a long moment, processing the sheer magnitude of Derek's betrayal. Forging a power of attorney is a serious state felony, Vance said softly. Add medical fraud and conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and your son and his wife are looking at a decade behind bars. They have handed you the rope, Nate. All you have to do is pull it. I set my glass down on the desk. The sound was a sharp crack in the quiet office. I do not want them in a jail cell yet, I said. Jail is too easy right now. Jail gives them a roof and a bed and a chance to play the victim. I want them to feel exactly what they were planning to do to me. I want them completely stripped of their power, their dignity, and their fake elite status. I want them humiliated in front of the very people they consider their superiors. I looked Vance dead in the eye and gave the final order. Initiate a full asset reappraisal for Rollins Holdings immediately. I want the formal eviction notices drafted, signed, and ready to serve. Then I want you to contact that predatory lending firm. Use a proxy company and buy up Derek's $500,000 debt. Pay whatever premium they want. I want to be his sole and absolute creditor by tomorrow morning. Vance smiled a cold and predatory smile. He opened his laptop and started typing rapidly. Consider the execution papers drafted, Nate. The self-made billionaire illusion is officially dead. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and buttoned my faded jacket. They wanted to treat me like a filthy squatter in my own property. They wanted to erase my mind and lock me in an asylum just to pave over my late wife's memory for a quick paycheck. They thought they were holding all the cards because I remained silent. They mistook my patience for weakness. I thanked Vance and walked out of the glass office. I had to get back to the house before Chloe noticed the old man was missing for too long. I knew that with the fake medical document now in their hands, they were going to make their final aggressive move to force me to sign away the suburban land. They were going to try to back me into a corner tonight. I could feel it. But I was ready to walk right into their trap, because they had absolutely no idea that the jaws of the trap were about to snap shut on their own necks. I walked back into the $2 million mansion through the side door. I kept my head down and shuffled my feet against the floorboards, playing the part of the exhausted and defeated old man. The house was unnervingly quiet. I turned the corner toward my small room by the laundry area and immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The door was wide open. I stepped inside and stopped dead in my tracks. My few belongings were scattered across the floor. My shirts were ripped from the small dresser and thrown into a corner. The mattress was pulled half off the bed frame. But none of that mattered. My eyes locked onto the floor near the foot of the bed, splintered mahogany wood, snapped brass gears, a tiny broken metal spring. It was Vivian's music box, the one I had bought for her on our first anniversary in 1976. It was the only piece of her I had kept in this house. Crushed, stomped on, destroyed like garbage. I did not have to wonder who did it. I heard the sharp and aggressive click of designer heels behind me. Chloe stepped into the doorway. Derek was right behind her, looking down at the floor with his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. Chloe was not smiling today. Her face was set in a mask of absolute coldness. She was holding a thick manila folder and a sleek silver pen. "Look at this mess," she said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "This is exactly what Dr. Evans was talking about. Your mind is completely gone, Nathaniel. You tore your own room apart. You destroyed your own things. You are a danger to yourself and to this family." I looked at her. Then I looked at the shattered pieces of the music box on the floor. My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. She had smashed my late wife's memory just to set a psychological stage to frame me as a lunatic. "I did not do this," I said, keeping my voice deliberately weak and shaky. Chloe ignored me completely. She tossed a heavy document onto my exposed mattress. "That is the official medical evaluation from yesterday," she said coldly. "It states that you are suffering from severe aggressive dementia. It recommends immediate and involuntary commitment to a state psychiatric facility. A judge will sign the order tomorrow morning. Once that happens, you will be locked in a white room. They will medicate you until you do not even know your own name, and you will never step foot outside again." I let out a ragged breath, playing the terrified victim to absolute perfection. "Why are you doing this to me?" I asked, letting my hands tremble by my sides. Chloe pulled a second document from her folder. It was a property deed transfer. "You own 10 acres of land out in the suburbs," she said, her eyes locked onto mine like a predator. "Land that you are doing absolutely nothing with. Derek and I have massive financial obligations. We need to liquidate that asset right now. So here is the deal, old man. You sign this property over to Derek tonight, and maybe we find a nice, quiet, and comfortable assisted living home for you. If you refuse, I submit the psychiatric evaluation tomorrow morning and the state takes you away in a straitjacket. Derek has already agreed to the plan. It is entirely up to you." I slowly shifted my gaze to my son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had protected from the harsh realities of the world. He was standing behind his wife, hiding in her shadow, avoiding my eyes. "Derek," I whispered, letting my voice crack with engineered heartbreak, "are you really going to let her do this to me? Are you going to let her lock your own father away?" Derek finally looked up. His face was pale and slick with sweat, but his eyes were completely selfish. "It is for the best, Dad," he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "You are not well. We are just trying to protect the family assets. You do not need that land anyway. Just sign the paper. Please, do not make this harder than it has to be." He was weak. He was pathetic. He was willing to throw his own father into a chemical prison to pay off his secret gambling debts and keep his arrogant white wife happy. In that exact second, any remaining mercy I had for him evaporated completely. He was no longer my son. He was just another greedy and corrupt contractor trying to steal a bid. I looked back at the shattered pieces of Vivian's music box. I let my shoulders slump completely. I let out a long, defeated sob, covering my face with my hands. I played the part of a broken and helpless old man who had finally been crushed by the weight of their cruelty. "Okay," I whispered, my voice shaking violently. "Okay. I will sign it. Just please do not lock me in that place. Please." Chloe's eyes lit up with malicious triumph. She stepped forward and shoved the silver pen into my hand. She pointed to the bottom line of the deed transfer document. "Right here," she ordered. "Sign your full legal name." I took the pen. I let my hand shake so badly that the tip of the pen rattled against the heavy paper. I slowly and painstakingly dragged the ink across the dotted line. Nathaniel Rollins. Chloe snatched the paper the second I finished the last letter. She inspected the signature, a massive and greedy smile spreading across her face. "See?" she sneered, looking back at Derek. "I told you we just had to push him a little. He does not have the spine to fight back." Derek let out a heavy sigh of relief, rubbing his hand over his face. "Thank you, Dad," he mumbled. It is for the best. Chloe turned on her heel, completely dismissing my existence. Pack your bags tonight, she tossed the words over her shoulder. We are moving you to a basic care facility on Monday. You are done living in my house. They walked out of the room, closing the door and leaving me alone in the dark. I listened to their footsteps fading down the hall. I heard Chloe let out a loud laugh. I heard the clinking of glasses as they went to the kitchen to celebrate their brilliant victory. They thought they had just stolen $1.2 million worth of prime real estate. They thought they had outsmarted a senile old fool and secured their elite lifestyle forever. But as the sound of their celebration echoed through the massive house, the trembling in my hands stopped entirely. I knelt down on the floor and carefully picked up the broken pieces of my wife's music box, placing them gently on the nightstand. Chloe and Derek had their signed deed, but they lacked the intelligence and the experience to understand the complex mechanics of high-wealth security. 10 years ago, when I first set up the Rollins Family Trust, my corporate lawyers advised me on strict protocols for extortion, kidnapping, and elder fraud. I registered a very specific secondary signature with all my banks, the county clerk, and my entire legal team, a signature that deliberately omitted my middle initial and used a completely different loop on the letter R. It was my official duress signature. Any legal document bearing that specific signature instantly triggers an automatic and unchangeable fraud alert across all financial networks. It invalidates the document immediately. It flags the transaction for federal review, and it signals my legal team that a major crime is actively in progress. I had just signed their deed transfer with the duress signature. Tomorrow morning, Chloe and her parents were going to waltz into the bank to finalize the sale of that land and collect their massive payday. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of threats and fake medical documents. They did not realize I had just handed them the exact shovel they would use to dig their own graves. The morning sun filtered through the small, high window of my laundry room. I could hear the frantic and joyful energy echoing from the kitchen upstairs. Chloe was practically buzzing. She had the signed deed to Vivian's land, and in her mind she had just secured her financial salvation. But Chloe and Derek were drowning in a $500,000 predatory loan, and a piece of paper does not pay off ruthless creditors. They needed liquid cash immediately. And that is where Richard Sterling, my arrogant and racist father-in-law, stepped into the picture. Richard considered himself a brilliant businessman. In reality, he was just a vulture who inherited a chain of car dealerships and spent his life stepping on people who had less power than him. When Chloe called him the night before, panicked about Derek's hidden debts and holding my freshly signed property deed, Richard saw an opportunity to perform the ultimate robbery. He knew the 10 acres of land Vivian had left me was prime commercial real estate. He knew it was recently appraised at $1.2 million, and he knew my son was absolutely desperate. So Richard made a ruthless offer. He told Derek he would buy the land from him directly under the table for $300,000 in cash. It was a fraction of the actual value. Richard planned to take the deed, wait a few months, and flip the property to commercial developers for a massive profit. He thought he was pulling off the heist of the century. He was taking advantage of his desperate son-in-law, and he was completely robbing a senile old black man who supposedly did not even know his own name anymore. Richard agreed to wire the money first thing in the morning to an escrow account to clear Derek's immediate debts. They needed me present at the bank to finalize the transfer of the deed. They dressed me in a worn-out, oversized sweater and told me to keep my mouth shut. Derek drove us to the largest wealth management bank in downtown Chicago. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, touching up her makeup and smiling at her own reflection. They were entirely convinced that they had won. We walked into the grand marble lobby of the bank. Richard and Susan Sterling were already there waiting for us. Richard was wearing a custom-tailored suit and a smug, predatory grin. Susan was holding her expensive designer bag, looking around the bank as if she owned the entire building. When they saw me shuffling behind Derek, Richard let out a quiet, condescending laugh. He looked at me not as a human being, but as a minor legal obstacle he was about to bulldoze over. We were led into a private, glass-walled conference room. I was instructed to sit in the corner far away from the heavy mahogany table where the adults were going to do business. I slumped into the leather chair, letting my head drop slightly, playing the part of the vacant and oblivious old man perfectly. But my eyes were sharp. I watched every single movement. The bank manager, a polite man in a gray suit, laid the paperwork on the table. Derek placed the deed transfer document right in the center, the document bearing my special duress signature. The manager glanced at it, typed a few things into his computer, and nodded. Since the deed was supposedly signed and notarized by their fake contact, the bank initiated the process to accept the buyer's funds. Richard pulled out his checkbook and his banking authorization codes. He looked at Derek with a triumphant smirk. "Consider this a painful lesson in finance, boy," Richard said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I am saving you from your own stupidity. Be thankful my daughter loves you enough to ask for my help." Derek swallowed hard, looking completely humiliated, but he nodded submissively. "Thank you, sir," Derek mumbled. Richard signed the authorization. He ordered his personal bank to wire $300,000 of his own liquid business capital directly into the secure escrow account. The manager tapped his keyboard, processing the massive transaction. It took only a few moments. Then the manager smiled and confirmed the wire had been successfully initiated and the funds were actively moving into the escrow holding. The atmosphere in the glass room instantly shifted into pure celebration. Chloe let out a squeal of joy and hugged her mother. Susan patted her daughter's hair, praising her for handling such a stressful situation. Richard stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and clapped Derek hard on the shoulder. "Problem solved," Richard announced loudly. "The money is in the holding account. Your debts will be cleared by tomorrow, and I am the proud new owner of 10 acres of prime real estate. Let us go get an early lunch to celebrate." They started walking toward the door, entirely ignoring my existence in the corner. They thought the game was over. They thought they had crossed the finish line, but they did not know about the invisible tripwire I had laid across the track. Just as Richard reached for the glass door handle, the bank manager's computer let out a sharp, high-pitched beep, then another. Then the screen flashed bright red. The manager stopped smiling. He frowned, leaning closer to his monitor. His face suddenly drained of all color. He looked up, his eyes darting nervously between Richard, Derek, and the glowing red screen. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," the manager said, his voice completely stripped of its previous warmth. "Please step away from the door." Richard turned around, looking annoyed. "What is the problem? I have a lunch reservation." The manager swallowed hard. "Sir, the escrow transaction has just been violently rejected by the federal banking oversight system. The $300,000 you just wired has been intercepted and completely frozen." The silence in the glass room was sudden and absolute. Chloe stopped smiling. Derek froze in his tracks. Richard marched back to the desk, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "What do you mean frozen?" "That is my liquid capital. Unfreeze it immediately." "I cannot do that, sir," the manager said, his hands visibly shaking now. The deed transfer document submitted by Mr. Rollins triggered a Level 1 security alert. The signature on this document is registered in the national database as a designated duress signature. It signals that the signatory was forced to sign under threat of violence or coercion. Derek let out a sound that was half gasp, half choke. He looked at me, sheer terror flooding his eyes. He finally realized that the old man had not been blindly signing his life away. But the manager was not finished. "Because you attempted to purchase a highly valued asset for a severely depressed price using a fraudulent document obtained through coercion, the federal system has automatically flagged your $300,000 wire transfer. It is being held under suspicion of money laundering, elder financial exploitation, and real estate fraud." Richard slammed his fists on the mahogany table. "That is absurd. Cancel the transaction. Send my money back to my account right now." "I am sorry, Mr. Sterling," the manager replied, stepping back from the desk. "The funds are no longer in our control. They are locked in a federal holding account pending a full criminal investigation by the authorities. You cannot withdraw it. You cannot cancel it. The money is effectively gone until the federal government clears you of these charges, and based on the alerts on my screen, they will be contacting you very shortly." Chloe let out a horrified sob, covering her mouth with both hands. Susan collapsed into one of the leather chairs, clutching her expensive bag as if it were a life preserver. Derek looked like he was about to pass out. He still owed $500,000 to ruthless predators, and now the only money that could have saved him was locked in a federal vault. Richard Sterling, the arrogant titan who thought he could steal from a helpless black man, stood completely paralyzed. His $300,000, his own hard-earned business capital, was trapped. He had happily wired his own money directly into a federal bear trap. I remained sitting in my corner. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I kept my head slightly bowed, playing the quiet and confused grandfather, but inside my blood was singing. They had wanted to play a game of deception and greed. Now they were officially caught in a web they could never untangle, and the most beautiful part of it all was that this was only the beginning. The real devastation was still waiting for them at home. After the absolute disaster at the bank, you would think a rational person would cancel a lavish party. You would think that knowing your own father-in-law had flagged a transaction for federal investigation would make you pause. But Chloe and my son Derek were not rational people. They were cornered animals entirely obsessed with maintaining their elite facade. The bank manager had practically told them they were under federal watch, yet within 48 hours Chloe was back to barking orders at caterers and florists inside the mansion. It was Saturday, the day of her highly anticipated charity gala. She was likely using a secondary credit card, begging for mercy to fund an event designed to impress the very people she was desperately trying to emulate. The house was a frenzy of activity. Men in uniform carried in towering floral arrangements and crystal champagne towers. The irony was almost suffocating. They were celebrating their fake wealth while standing on the absolute brink of total annihilation. I stayed out of the way, shuffling toward the kitchen to get a simple glass of water. I wore my faded gray sweatpants and a worn-out cardigan, playing my part. The caterers ignored me, assuming I was the hired help or a confused relative they were paid not to acknowledge. But Chloe did not ignore me. She spotted me from across the marble foyer. She was wearing a silk robe, her hair pinned up in rollers, her face painted with aggressive and sharp makeup. She marched toward me, her eyes burning with a toxic mixture of stress, hatred, and absolute panic. She grabbed me by the sleeve of my cardigan and practically shoved me toward the hallway leading to my cramped room. "You are not to be seen today," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "Do you understand me, old man? You stay in your room. You do not come out for water. You do not come out to use the main bathroom. You do not even look through the crack in the door. I have the mayor, the city council, and the most important socialites in Chicago arriving in less than 4 hours. I am not going to let you ruin this for me." I looked at her, keeping my expression entirely blank. I let my hands shake slightly, holding the empty glass. She leaned in closer, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure bigotry and classism. "Do not let my friends see a smelly black man wandering around my $2 million house," she spat, her words laced with absolute poison. "You are an embarrassment. You are a burden. Just sit in the dark and pretend you do not exist." To make sure her threat was enforced, she snapped her fingers. A massive man in a black suit, a private security guard she had hired for the event, stepped into the hallway. "Stand right here," Chloe ordered the guard, pointing at the space right outside my bedroom door. "Do not let him out under any circumstances. If he tries to open the door, push him back inside. Lock it from the outside if you have to. He is mentally unstable and I will not have him wandering into my gala." The security guard nodded, crossing his thick arms over his chest. Chloe gave me one last look of absolute disgust, turned on her designer heels, and walked back to the foyer to continue directing the installation of her crystal champagne tower. The heavy wooden door clicked shut in my face. I was officially a prisoner in my own home. I stood in the center of the cramped, windowless room, listening to the muffled sounds of the extravagant preparations outside. I heard the clinking of expensive silverware. I heard Chloe practicing her fake high society laugh. She called it her $2 million house. She called me a smelly black man. She hired a thug to guard my door like a prison warden. 40 years ago, a comment like that would have ended with me throwing someone through a plate glass window. I grew up in an era where men like me had to fight for the right to simply walk down the street. I built a corporate empire in a city that constantly tried to shut me out because of the color of my skin. I did not survive the brutal construction industry of Chicago by being weak. I survived by being smarter, colder, and far more ruthless than the people who tried to step on me. I walked over to the edge of my cheap mattress and sat down. I did not yell. I did not bang my fists against the door. I simply smiled in the dark. Chloe was busy polishing the brass on the Titanic while it was already sinking to the bottom of the ocean. She was about to host a gala to raise money for charity, completely blind to the fact that by tomorrow morning she was going to be the one needing a charitable donation just to buy a meal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my secure, encrypted smartphone. I did not need the old laptop today. I just needed to wait for the signal. The music outside grew louder. A string quartet began warming up in the living room. The guests were starting to arrive. I could hear the expensive cars pulling up the long driveway, the valets rushing to open doors, the booming voices of the Chicago elite stepping into what they thought was the prestigious Rollins estate. I sat in the darkness listening to my son greet his wealthy guests, pretending to be a titan of industry, while his actual life was crumbling into dust. Then the screen of my phone lit up in the dim room. It was a single encrypted text message from Arthur Vance, my lead attorney. I opened the message. It contained exactly 3 sentences. The predatory loan has been fully acquired by Rollins Holdings, LLC. You are now Derek's sole and absolute creditor. The judge has officially approved the immediate foreclosure and eviction order. I read the words twice, letting the absolute magnitude of the victory wash over me. The trap was completely closed. Derek no longer owed a nameless private equity firm. He owed me. And because he was months behind on his payments, my company now had the full legal right to seize the asset immediately. The house Chloe was currently parading around in was officially mine to take back right this very second. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Outside my door, the charity gala was in full swing. The rich and powerful were drinking expensive champagne, laughing at Chloe's jokes, admiring the marble floors and the imported chandeliers. I stood up from the bed. I walked over to the small closet and opened the door. I pushed aside the faded flannel shirts and the scuffed work boots. Reaching into the back, I pulled out a protective garment bag I had smuggled into the house a week ago. I unzipped it slowly. Inside was a custom-tailored midnight black Tom Ford tuxedo. I had worn it 20 years ago to a charity gala where I was the guest of honor back when Vivian was still alive to adjust my bow tie. It was the armor of a man who owned entire city blocks. I took off the gray sweatpants and the old cardigan. I put on the crisp white shirt, the silk bow tie, and the tailored jacket. It still fit perfectly. Chloe told me to stay in the dark. She told me not to let her wealthy friends see me. She wanted to lock me away and erase my existence. But I was not going to stay in the dark. I was going to walk right past her hired muscle step into the absolute center of her perfect, fragile little world, and I was going to burn it completely to the ground. I stood in front of the small and cracked mirror in my cramped room, adjusting the silk bow tie of my midnight black Tom Ford tuxedo. The heavy fabric felt like a second skin. It had been years since I wore it, but it fit perfectly. For 3 long years I had walked with a stoop. I had let my hands shake. I had kept my eyes glued to the floorboards. I had swallowed every insult, every condescending remark, and every racist microaggression my daughter-in-law threw my way. But tonight the performance was officially over. I rolled my shoulders back. I stood at my full height. The frail and senile old man Chloe, completely despised, vanished into the shadows of that laundry room. Nathaniel Rollins, the man who poured the concrete foundations of Chicago commercial skyline, had returned. Through the thin drywall, I could hear the absolute pinnacle of high society gathered in the living room, the clinking of expensive crystal flutes, the soft and pretentious laughter of the city elite. Chloe had pulled out all the stops for her charity gala. She had invited the mayor, several city council members, and dozens of wealthy white socialites she desperately wanted to impress. I could hear her voice carrying over the string quartet, loud, arrogant, and boasting. "Oh yes, Derek and I just fell in love with the architecture," she was saying to a group of guests. I could picture her standing by the grand marble staircase draped in an expensive gown she bought with my stolen money. It took years of incredibly hard work and sacrifice to afford a property like this in such an exclusive neighborhood. But when you are truly dedicated to building a legacy, you make it happen. We built this life with our own 2 hands. The sheer audacity of her lies was almost impressive. She was standing in a house I paid for entirely in cash, drinking champagne paid for by a maxed-out credit card I had just frozen, bragging about a legacy she was actively trying to destroy by throwing me into a mental asylum. She thought her biggest problem tonight was making sure the caterers served the caviar at the exact right temperature. She had no idea a Category 5 hurricane was about to tear straight through her custom mahogany front door. I turned the brass knob of my bedroom door and pulled it open. The massive private security guard Chloe had hired was standing right outside, his thick arms crossed over his chest. When he saw the door open, he immediately stepped forward, ready to aggressively shove the poor and crazy old man back into the dark. He opened his mouth to bark an order, but he stopped. His hand froze in midair. He looked at me, and his brain completely failed to process the image. He had been explicitly told to guard a smelly, senile, and helpless old man in dirty sweatpants. Instead, he was standing face to face with a 71-year-old man in a pristine, custom-tailored tuxedo, radiating the kind of absolute and undeniable authority that you simply cannot fake. I did not yell. I did not raise my hands. I just looked him dead in the eye with the cold and unblinking stare of a man who used to fire corrupt union bosses before his morning coffee. "Step aside, son," I said. My voice was deep, resonant, and completely steady. "Or tomorrow morning you will find out exactly why your security firm no longer has a license to operate in Cook County." The guard swallowed hard. The aggressive posture melted right off his massive frame. He recognized real power when he saw it. Without a single word of protest, he took a step back and lowered his hands, flattening himself against the wall to let me pass. I walked down the long hallway and stepped directly into the grand foyer. The living room was a sea of designer dresses and expensive suits. Waiters in white gloves were circulating with silver trays of appetizers. The live string quartet was playing a lively classical piece in the corner. Chloe was holding court near the massive stone fireplace, holding a glass of champagne, completely surrounded by the parents of her wealthy friends. Derek stood slightly behind her, wearing a forced and highly nervous smile, holding his drink like a defensive shield. I did not sneak in. I walked straight into the absolute center of the room. My leather dress shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor with slow, deliberate, and heavy steps. In a room full of people trying desperately to look important, true power shifts the gravity of the space. I did not have to say a single word. The wealthy guests nearest to me noticed me first. Their conversations trailed off into confused whispers. They instinctively stepped aside, their eyes widening at the imposing figure walking through their ranks. The silence spread like a ripple in a pond. One by one, the elite guests turned to look. The string quartet, sensing the sudden and dramatic shift in the energy of the room, faltered. The cellist stopped. Then the violinists. The music died completely. The sudden absolute quiet caused Chloe to turn her head. Her eyes locked onto me, and I watched the color completely drain from her face. She looked as if she had just seen a ghost walk right out of the walls. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at my posture. She looked at my clothes. The custom Tom Ford tuxedo, the perfectly tied silk bow, the expensive gold cufflinks. This was not the broken and pathetic victim she had planned to lock in a psychiatric ward tomorrow morning. This was an executioner walking to the block. Derek saw me a second later. His glass of champagne slipped right out of his hand and shattered violently against the marble floor. The sharp crash echoed through the dead silent room, but nobody even flinched. They were all staring at me. Nathaniel, Chloe finally hissed. Her voice was trembling with a toxic mixture of shock, embarrassment, and rising panic. She quickly plastered a fake and terrified smile on her face for her guests, then darted across the room toward me. She grabbed my arm in a vice grip, trying to pull me toward the hallway. "What do you think you are doing?" she whispered through clenched teeth, her manicured nails digging fiercely into my expensive jacket sleeve. "I told you to stay hidden. You are ruining my event. Get back downstairs right now before I call the hospital and have them drag you out of here in a straitjacket." I stopped walking. I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor. I looked down at her hand gripping my sleeve. Then I looked her directly in her panicked eyes. "Take your hand off my property, Chloe," I said. I did not whisper. I let my voice carry effortlessly across the silent room, ensuring every single VIP guest heard me perfectly. "Take your hand off me before I remind you who actually owns the ground you are standing on." The guests gasped collectively. A city councilman raised his eyebrows in profound shock. Susan and Richard Sterling, Chloe's arrogant parents, pushed their way to the front of the crowd, looking completely outraged by my presence. Derek Richard barked, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "What is the meaning of this? Control your father immediately. He is making an embarrassing scene in front of the mayor." Chloe lost the last shred of her carefully constructed composure. The elitist and racist venom she had been hiding behind her high society mask finally boiled over in front of everyone. She could not handle the humiliation of her wealthy friends watching her lose control of her perfect narrative. "Security," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria, echoing off the crystal chandeliers above us. "Security, get in here right now. Grab this crazy old man and throw him out into the street. Drag him out of my house." Two heavy security guards rushed into the living room from the front doors, responding to her frantic screaming. They moved aggressively toward me, reaching out to grab my arms and physically remove me from the gala. Chloe stood there breathing heavily, a triumphant and vicious glare returning to her eyes. She thought she had won. She thought she could just use hired muscle to throw me out like a bag of trash and return to her perfect and fake life. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I just waited for the exact moment the universe would deliver my ultimate justice. because right as the guards reached out to grab my shoulders, the heavy wooden front doors of the mansion were violently pushed wide open. But it was not more private security coming to help them. It was the flashing red and blue lights of 3 Cook County Sheriff Squad cars parked diagonally across the front lawn, illuminating the entire foyer in a blinding and rhythmic glare. The 2 massive security guards lunged forward, their thick hands reaching for the sleeves of my custom tuxedo. I did not step back. I simply shifted my weight and shrugged them off with a sudden and violent force that surprised them both. "Do not touch me!" I warned, my voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. They froze and glanced back at Chloe for direction, but the absolute authority in my eyes held them completely paralyzed. They were paid hourly wages to stand around looking tough, not to assault an older man who carried himself like a seasoned general. I turned away from them and began walking toward the front of the room. Chloe had set up a small stage with a sleek glass podium and a microphone for her charity speeches. I walked with deliberate purpose. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted before me like the Red Sea. They were whispering, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and pure fascination. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses stopped entirely. The only sound in the massive room was the sharp and steady click of my leather shoes against the marble floor. Richard Sterling could not handle the loss of control. He pushed his way through the crowd, his face purple with absolute rage. "You crazy old fool," Richard shouted, completely abandoning his fake high society manners. "You are embarrassing my daughter. You belong in a cage." Susan Sterling chimed in right behind him, pointing her manicured finger at my face. "Someone call the police right now," she shrieked. "This filthy man is trespassing and ruining our elegant evening. Get him out of our sight before he hurts somebody." I did not even look at them. Their insults were nothing but the buzzing of flies to me. I stepped onto the low stage and stood directly behind the glass podium. I reached out and tapped the microphone. A loud and sharp feedback sound echoed through the massive living room, silencing the crowd instantly. Everyone stared at me, holding their breath, waiting to see what the crazy old man was going to do next. That was when my son finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. Derek saw his entire fake life flashing before his eyes. He realized I was about to speak into a live microphone in front of his boss, the mayor, and every single person he desperately wanted to impress. "Dad, no." Derek screamed, sprinting across the marble floor. Derek rushed up the steps of the stage. He lunged at me, grabbing the metal stand of the microphone with both hands, trying to physically rip it away from my grip. "Have you lost your mind?" Derek hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of sheer panic and expensive champagne. "Stop this right now. You are destroying my life. Let go of the microphone, or I swear to God I will have you locked in the psychiatric ward tonight. I will not wait until tomorrow morning." I held on to the microphone stand with a grip forged by 40 years of hauling steel and pouring concrete. Derek pulled with all his might, but he could not move the heavy metal base an inch. I looked deep into his terrified and selfish eyes. "You destroyed your own life the second you decided to forge my signature," I whispered back so only he could hear. "You sold your own father for a fraction of a predatory loan." Before Derek could pull the microphone again, a piercing sound shattered the tension in the room. The loud wail of heavy sirens echoed from the street outside. It was not just one siren. It was a loud chorus of them, growing closer and more aggressive by the second. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive front windows, casting spinning and frantic shadows across the terrified faces of the wealthy guests. Chloe let out a loud and victorious laugh. She marched toward the front of the stage, her chest heaving with arrogant pride. "See," she yelled, pointing directly at me. "I told you. The authorities are here. They are here to take you away. You pushed me too far, Nathaniel. I called them the second you walked out of your miserable little room. You are going straight to the state psychiatric ward in handcuffs." The heavy mahogany front doors of the mansion were violently pushed wide open. But it was not the local beat cops or medical paramedics coming to take a sick old man away. 4 heavily armed officers stepped into the grand foyer. They were wearing tactical vests with bold yellow letters spelling out Cook County Sheriff Department across their chests. The lead officer, a tall and imposing man with a thick mustache, unclipped a radio from his shoulder and stepped into the center of the living room. He did not look at me. He did not look at the private security guards. He looked directly at the crowd of rich socialites and raised a thick stack of official legal documents in his right hand. "I am looking for Derek Rollins," the sheriff announced, his booming voice cutting through the dead silence of the luxury gala. Chloe smiled brightly and stepped forward, pointing up at the stage. "Yes, officer, that is my husband right there," she said, her voice dripping with sweet satisfaction and arrogant relief. "Please come up here and remove this crazy old man from our property. He has lost his mind and is threatening our guests." The sheriff did not even look at me. He walked straight past Chloe, completely ignoring her outstretched hand and her commands. He marched right up the short steps of the stage, looked my sweating son dead in the eye, and forcefully handed him the thick stack of papers. "Derek Rollins," the sheriff said, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear perfectly. "By order of the Cook County Circuit Court, I am hereby serving you with a final notice of foreclosure and an immediate asset seizure mandate. This property is now under the legal possession of Rollins Holdings, LLC. You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate these premises before my officers begin physically removing you, your wife, and every single guest from this building." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. Derek stared at the thick stack of papers in his shaking hands. The color completely vanished from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the bottom. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. Chloe did not understand. Her brain simply refused to process the words the sheriff had just spoken. She stomped up the stairs of the stage, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the wood. She snatched the papers right out of her husband's hands and shoved them back toward the sheriff. "This is a mistake," she screamed, her voice shrill and hysterical. "You have the wrong address. This is my house. I am the lady of this house. We bought this property 3 years ago. We are hosting a charity gala for the mayor. You cannot just walk in here and tell us to leave. I will have your badge for this. My father knows the governor." The sheriff did not even blink. He had dealt with entitled criminals his entire career. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and completely devoid of sympathy. "There is no mistake. The address is correct. The legal names are correct. You have 28 minutes remaining to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you interfere with a court-ordered eviction, you will be placed in handcuffs and removed by force." Chloe turned to Derek. "Tell him," she demanded violently, shaking his arm. "Tell him we own this house, Derek. Tell him to get out." But Derek could not speak. His knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the stage right in front of the glass podium, falling to his hands and knees. He buried his face in the wooden floorboards, sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion of the self-made titan of industry was completely shattered. He was just a broke and terrified little boy. I stepped forward. I leaned into the microphone. The high-pitched feedback whined for a second before my deep voice filled the massive $2 million living room. "He cannot tell them that, Chloe," I said. "Because if he does, he would be committing perjury in front of 4 armed officers of the law." Chloe whipped her head around to look at me. Her eyes were wide with a frantic, wild energy. "Shut up," she spat at me. "You crazy old man. This is your fault. You called them. You made up some crazy lie. I am going to have you locked away forever." I reached inside the breast pocket of my custom Tom Ford tuxedo. I pulled out a folded set of official corporate documents. I smoothed them out flat on the glass podium for everyone to see. The wealthy guests in the audience were leaning in. Dozens of smartphones were already raised in the air, recording every single second of her absolute destruction. "You do not own a single brick of this property, Chloe," I said, speaking slowly and clearly into the microphone so the entire room could hear her humiliation. "You do not own the marble floors. You do not own the crystal chandeliers. You do not even own the dirt under the grass in the front yard." "That is a lie," she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "We signed the mortgage papers." "You signed a piece of paper that your husband put in front of you," I corrected her. "But it was not a mortgage. It was a residential lease agreement. This property was purchased 5 years ago completely in cash by a private corporation named Rollins Holdings, LLC." Chloe froze. Her parents, Richard and Susan Sterling, standing in the front row, suddenly looked like they had been struck by lightning. "And as for Rollins Holdings, LLC, I continued, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "I am the sole owner and the chief executive officer. I bought this house. I allowed your husband to rent it from my company for exactly $1 a month so he could pretend to be a big shot and impress your arrogant family. You are not the queen of this castle, Chloe. You are just a guest living on my charity." The crowd erupted into loud gasps. Wealthy socialites covered their mouths in shock. Whispers spread like wildfire across the room. The fake elite status Chloe had spent years building was being publicly executed on a stage of her own making. She shook her head violently, stepping backward. "No," she gasped. "No, that is not true. Derek makes a fortune. We have money. We are wealthy. I looked down at my son, who was still weeping on the floor. Derek does not have a dime, I announced to the room, completely stripping away his fake armor. He blew his entire life savings on the stock market trying to pay for your designer clothes and your expensive vacations. He is completely broke. Richard Sterling pushed his way to the edge of the stage. His face was a mask of pure fury and humiliation. He looked up at me. Then what about the eviction, he demanded, trying to salvage any shred of dignity. If he is renting for $1 a month, how is he being foreclosed on? I smiled. It was a cold and calculating smile that sent a shiver through the room. Because renting this house was not Derek's only financial mistake, I explained. Your son-in-law secretly took out a $500,000 predatory loan from a private equity firm to cover his massive gambling debts. A loan he defaulted on 3 months ago. I looked back at Chloe, who was now trembling so violently she could barely stand. Yesterday afternoon, I continued my company legally purchased that exact debt. I am now your husband's sole and absolute creditor. And because he is in default, I exercise my legal right to seize his remaining assets and terminate his lease agreement effectively immediately. Your lease is officially canceled. Chloe let out a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob. It was the sound of a completely broken ego. She looked out at the sea of guests. She saw the mayor shaking his head in disgust. She saw her wealthy friends recording her absolute downfall, holding their phones up like weapons. The people she had spent years trying to impress were now documenting her ultimate humiliation. "You planned this," she whispered, staring at me with tears of pure hatred streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. "You set us up." "I did not set you up," I replied, my voice completely steady. "I just stopped paying for your lies. You called my music trash. You called me a smelly black man and tried to hide me in a laundry room. You ate food bought with my money while plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my dead wife's land." I stepped away from the podium and walked right up to her. I looked down into her terrified eyes. "You thought I was a weak and senile old fool," I said softly, so only she and Derek could hear. "But you forgot one thing. I built the buildings you people work in. I wired the banks that hold your money. I survived in a world that tried to crush me every single day. You are nothing but a spoiled child playing dress-up with my credit cards." I turned back to the sheriff, who was standing quietly watching the scene unfold. "Sheriff," I said loudly, "you can begin clearing my property now. I want these trespassers removed immediately." The sheriff nodded. He turned to his deputies and gave the signal. "All right, folks, the party is officially over," the sheriff announced over the crowd. "Everyone make your way to the exits. If you do not live here, you need to leave right now." The mass exodus began. The elite socialites of Chicago scrambled toward the front doors, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal of the Rollins family. They whispered and pointed, casting disgusted glances at Chloe and Derek. Susan Sterling grabbed her husband's arm, sobbing hysterically. "Richard, we have to do something," she cried. "Do not let them treat our daughter this way." Richard looked at his daughter and then looked at my son crying on the floor. For a man who prided himself on control, he had absolutely none left. He realized that aligning his family with Derek was the biggest mistake of his life. He turned his back in disgust and marched toward the door, leaving his daughter standing on the stage completely ruined. The deputies moved in. One of them grabbed Derek by the arm, pulling him up from the floorboards. Another approached Chloe, pointing toward the exit. "You have 20 minutes to pack a bag, ma'am," the deputy said. "Move." Chloe did not move. She stood there staring at the empty living room, the half-drunk glasses of champagne, the silent string quartet instruments. Her perfect illusion was dead. The house, the money, the status, it was all gone. She was nothing. And I stood there in my custom tuxedo watching the authorities escort them out of my house, knowing that my ultimate revenge had just been flawlessly executed. But the night was not over yet, because Richard Sterling thought he could just walk away from this mess. He thought he could escape the fallout. He had no idea that I was about to drop the final hammer on his head, too. The exodus of the wealthy elite had slowed down at the massive front doors. Human curiosity is a powerful thing. Even though the sheriff had ordered them to leave, dozens of high society guests lingered in the foyer, watching the destruction of the Rollins family like it was a theatrical performance. Richard Sterling stopped halfway to the exit. He turned around, his face pale but his jaw set with the arrogant stubbornness of a man who believed wealth could erase any mistake. He looked at his daughter Chloe, who was hyperventilating near the stage, and then he looked at me. I could see the gears turning in his head. He thought this was simply a matter of unpaid debts. He thought he could pull out his checkbook and buy his way out of humiliation. "Listen to me very carefully," Richard said, marching back toward the glass podium. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a leather-bound checkbook. "I do not care about your little corporate shell game, Nathaniel. You want money. That is what this is all about. Name your price. I will write a check right now to cover Derek's debt and purchase this property outright. You take the money, you call off these sheriffs, and you walk away." I looked down at the checkbook in his shaking hand. Then I looked at his eyes. He was terrified. He was trying to project power, but he was begging. "Put your checkbook away, Richard," I said calmly into the microphone. "Your money has absolutely no power in this house. You cannot buy respect, and you certainly cannot buy your way out of the crimes your daughter has committed." "Crimes?" Richard scoffed, his voice rising in defense. "Do not be ridiculous. Being late on a mortgage is not a crime. You are just a bitter and vindictive old man trying to ruin a young couple because you are jealous of their success. I will hire the best defense attorneys in Chicago. I will tie you up in court until you are bankrupt." I smiled. It was the moment I had been waiting for. The perfect setup for the second devastating blow. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. During my years as an electrical contractor, I learned a lot about audio-visual systems. I had built the media room in this very house. Before I walked upstairs in my tuxedo, I had quietly connected my phone to the mansion's master Bluetooth audio system, the same system that was currently pumping soft classical music through the invisible ceiling speakers in every single room. "You want to talk about crimes, Richard?" I asked, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "Let us talk about what your daughter does when she thinks nobody is listening. Let us talk about how far she is willing to go to maintain her fake elite lifestyle." I tapped the screen of my phone. The string quartet music completely cut out. For a split second, there was total silence. Then a sharp click echoed through the high-definition speakers above us, followed by voices. The sound was crystal clear, amplified for every single remaining guest police officer and caterer to hear. "Here is the rest of the payment," Chloe's recorded voice boomed from the ceiling. It sounded harsh, commanding, and absolutely ruthless. $5,000 in cash, just like we agreed. You will have the signed medical evaluation delivered to me by tomorrow morning, right?" Chloe gasped loudly. She slapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes bulging with pure, unadulterated horror. She recognized her own voice instantly. Next came the smooth and confident voice of the fake doctor she had hired. "Yes, Mrs. Rollins. The paperwork will be absolutely airtight. It will state that he requires immediate institutionalization due to severe cognitive decline and violent paranoia. The court will not question a single word of it. My signature looks extremely official. Just make sure it is backdated," Chloe's voice demanded over the speakers. "And remember, if anyone ever asks, you have been treating him for the past 6 months. "Do not worry," the man replied. "I have done this a dozen times for wealthy families like yours. Enjoy your new peace of mind." I paused the recording. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The guests standing by the doors looked at Chloe with utter disgust. This was no longer just a financial scandal. This was pure and calculated evil. They were looking at a woman who had tried to medically erase a perfectly healthy human being just to steal his assets. Susan Sterling let out a pathetic whimper, clutching her husband's arm. Richard stared at his daughter in absolute disbelief. Even a ruthless businessman like him could not stomach the reality of medical fraud and forced institutionalization. But the most dramatic reaction did not come from Chloe or her parents. It came from the back of the room near the catering tables. A man in a sharp gray suit suddenly dropped his champagne glass and bolted toward the kitchen exit. It was the fake doctor Chloe had hired. She was so incredibly arrogant that she had actually invited her partner in crime to her high society gala, probably to show off her wealth and ensure he kept his mouth shut. He did not make it 3 steps. 2 men who had been standing quietly among the guests suddenly moved with terrifying speed and precision. They did not look like wealthy socialites anymore. They moved like trained tactical operators. One man grabbed the fake doctor by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed him hard against the marble wall. The sound of bone hitting stone echoed loudly. "Do not move a single muscle," the agent commanded, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. The second man stepped forward and reached inside his suit jacket. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming gold badge. He held it up high so everyone in the room could see it clearly. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agent announced, his voice carrying the absolute weight of the United States government. Chloe collapsed to the floor. Her knees just gave out. She sat on the expensive rug in her designer gown, weeping hysterically, shaking her head back and forth as if trying to wake up from a bad dream. Derek remained curled in a ball near the stage, completely broken. The lead FBI agent walked slowly toward the center of the room. He looked at the fake doctor, who was now securely handcuffed against the wall, and then he looked directly at Chloe and Derek. "We have been tracking that man for 6 months, the agent said, pointing at the fake doctor. "His real name is Paul Hayes. He is not a medical professional. He is a convicted document forger, and thanks to the audio evidence provided by Mr. Nathaniel Rollins, we now have undeniable proof of a criminal transaction." The agent stopped right in front of Chloe. He looked down at her with complete professional detachment. "Chloe Rollins and Derek Rollins," the agent continued, "you are now officially subjects of an active federal investigation for conspiracy to commit medical fraud, wire fraud, and the attempted financial exploitation of a senior citizen. You will surrender your passports immediately. If you attempt to leave the state of Illinois, you will be arrested on sight." Richard Sterling finally found his voice, but it was weak and trembling. He took a step toward the federal agent. "Officer," he stammered, "I assure you my wife and I had absolutely no knowledge of this. We did not know they were planning to fake medical records. We are completely innocent in this matter." He was abandoning his daughter. The moment federal prison became a reality, the great Richard Sterling threw his own child straight under the bus to save his own reputation. He backed away from Chloe as if she were carrying a deadly disease. I looked down from the podium. I watched Chloe reach a hand out toward her father, begging for help. But Richard just looked away. She had nobody left. Her husband was a bankrupt coward crying on the floor. Her parents were distancing themselves to avoid federal charges. Her wealthy friends were recording her downfall to post on the internet. She had tried to put me in a white padded room where nobody would ever hear my voice again. Now she was the one trapped in a nightmare, entirely surrounded by people, yet completely and utterly alone. The local sheriff stepped forward again, looking at his watch. "You have 15 minutes left to get off Mr. Rollins' property," the sheriff reminded them. The federal agents hauled the fake doctor out the front doors, his head pushed down as they shoved him into a black vehicle. The flashing lights of the police cruisers continued to spin, casting long shadows across the empty champagne glasses and the ruined decorations. I took a deep breath. The air in my house finally felt clean, but I was not finished. Richard Sterling thought he was walking out of my house as an innocent bystander. He thought he had successfully distanced himself from the wreckage. He was wrong, because the ultimate trap I had set for him had just locked shut, and it was time to let him know he was going down with the ship. The federal agents had just dragged the fake doctor through the heavy mahogany doors. The flashing red and blue lights painted the walls of my foyer in a chaotic rhythm. Most of the elite guests had already scrambled to their cars, desperate to wash the stench of this scandal off their expensive clothes. Richard Sterling and his wife Susan were trying to do exactly the same thing. I watched them inching toward the exit, keeping their heads down, trying to blend in with the last few stragglers. Richard had his hand firmly on the small of his wife's back, pushing her toward the door. He was a coward, pretending to be a king. He thought that just because he had not physically forged the medical documents, he could simply walk back to his luxury car, drive back to his pristine suburban estate, and pretend this entire night never happened. He thought he could leave his daughter to take the fall while he protected his own image. I stepped down from the stage and walked slowly across the marble floor. My leather shoes echoed in the emptying room. "Richard," I called out. My voice was not loud, but it carried the absolute weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "You are forgetting something." Richard stopped dead in his tracks just 3 feet from the front door. He stiffened. He slowly turned around his face, a mask of deeply wounded pride and bubbling rage. Susan hid behind his shoulder, clutching her pearls, looking at me as if I were a monster. "I have nothing more to say to you, Nathaniel." Richard spat, his voice shaking with a pathetic attempt at authority. "My wife and I are leaving." We have absolutely no part in this disgraceful circus. Derek's financial failures and my daughter's poor judgment are their own burdens to bear. We are washing our hands of this entire situation. He was really going to do it. He was going to completely abandon his own flesh and blood to save his car dealership empire. You might be washing your hands, Richard, I said, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away. But the stain is not going to come off. In fact, it has already soaked right through to your bank accounts. Richard narrowed his eyes. What are you talking about? I am talking about this morning, I replied smoothly. I am talking about the $300,000 of your liquid business capital that you so eagerly wired into a federal escrow account. The money you tried to use to buy my dead wife's 10 acres of land for a fraction of its actual value. Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. That was a blocked transaction. The bank manager said the funds were temporarily frozen. My lawyers will have that money returned to my primary accounts by Monday morning. It is a minor inconvenience caused by your little trap. Nothing more. I shook my head slowly, letting a cold and predatory smile touch my lips. You really do not understand how federal banking security works, do you, Richard? You think you can just call a customer service representative and complain your way out of a felony? Susan grabbed her husband's arm, her eyes wide with sudden terror. What does he mean, Richard? She whispered. Let me explain it to you very clearly, I said, making sure my voice carried to the sheriff deputies who were still lingering near the doorway. When you attempted to purchase a highly valuable asset using a forged power of attorney, you did not just trigger a temporary hold. That escrow account was flagged by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. The system automatically generated a suspicious activity report. Richard started to turn pale. His arrogant posture began to crumble piece by piece. You did not just try to buy land, I continued relentlessly. You attempted to capitalize on the financial exploitation of a senior citizen. You actively participated in a conspiracy to launder money through a fraudulent real estate transaction. And because you used your corporate business accounts to wire the funds across state lines, you elevated this from a local dispute to a federal wire fraud investigation. Richard opened his mouth, but the words died in his throat. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in erratic spasms. The FBI agents who just walked out of this house with your daughter's fake doctor, I said softly. They did not just come here for him. They are actively building a case file with your name printed right on the cover. And the absolute best part, Richard, the absolute pinnacle of this entire situation is that the Internal Revenue Service has been automatically notified. They are going to audit every single car dealership you own. They are going to tear through 40 years of your financial records, looking for every single tax loophole, every hidden asset, and every fraudulent transaction you have ever made. Susan let out a horrifying shriek and collapsed against the heavy wooden doorframe. She began weeping uncontrollably, her perfect high society facade completely destroyed. She knew exactly what an audit would find. People who try to steal from the elderly never have clean books. Richard staggered backward. He looked like a man who had just been shot in the stomach but had not fully realized he was bleeding to death. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You are a monster, he whispered, his voice completely broken. You destroyed my family. I stepped right into his personal space, towering over him in my custom tuxedo. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer intensity of my words made him flinch. I did not destroy your family, Richard. You did. You raised a daughter who thought people were disposable. You taught her that greed was a virtue and that empathy was a weakness. You tried to rob an old black man blind because you thought I was too stupid and too helpless to fight back. You dug this grave with your own 2 hands. Now you get to lie in it. Good luck with the IRS. I turned my back on him. It was the ultimate display of disrespect, and he absolutely deserved it. Richard did not say another word. He grabbed his weeping wife by the arm and dragged her out the front door, fleeing into the cold Chicago night. He did not look back at Chloe. He did not say goodbye to his daughter. He just ran like a coward, knowing his entire empire was about to be burned to ashes. I walked back toward the center of the living room. The sheriff deputies were finishing their sweep of the property. Chloe was standing near the grand staircase. She was completely alone. Her wealthy friends were gone. Her parents had abandoned her to save their own skins. Her fake doctor was sitting in a federal interrogation room, and her husband was sitting on the floor staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic. A female deputy approached Chloe holding a clipboard. "Mom, your time is up," the deputy said firmly. You need to vacate the premises right now." Chloe looked down at her hands. She was wearing a stunning designer evening gown that probably cost more than a car. Diamonds glittered around her neck, but all of it was completely worthless now. She looked up at me. Her eyes were hollow, completely drained of the venom and the arrogance that had defined her entire existence. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have no money. My credit cards are blocked. My parents just drove away. I do not even have a coat." I looked at her. I thought about the music box she had smashed. I thought about the words she used when she told the security guard to keep the smelly black man locked in the laundry room. I thought about the psychiatric ward she had planned to send me to tomorrow morning. I felt absolutely no pity. "That sounds like a problem for the street," I replied, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Get out of my house." The deputy took Chloe by the arm and firmly guided her toward the front door. Chloe did not fight back. She did not scream. The psychological devastation was so complete that she simply surrendered to the physical motion. She walked out of the double doors in her freezing evening gown, stepping out into the harsh and unforgiving reality of the night. Derek was next. 2 deputies hauled my son to his feet. He looked at me with eyes full of desperate, pathetic pleading. He was about to speak. He was about to ask for a second chance. But I knew exactly what I had to do next to finalize this necessary destruction. Because dealing with an enemy is easy. Dealing with your own blood requires a completely different kind of coldness. The heavy double doors closed behind the last sheriff deputy. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded down the long driveway, leaving the $2 million mansion in a suffocating and heavy silence. The string quartet had left their sheet music scattered on the floor. Half-empty crystal champagne flutes sat abandoned on expensive tables, the bubbles long gone. I stood in the absolute center of the grand marble foyer, smoothing the lapels of my custom Tom Ford tuxedo. The air in the house was finally still. The elite crowd was gone. The fake doctor was in federal custody. Chloe had been thrown out into the freezing night. But there was one last piece of garbage that needed to be taken out. I turned my attention toward the stage. Derek was still there. He had not moved to follow his wife. He had not run out into the dark to comfort the woman he supposedly loved so much that he was willing to destroy his own father for her. Instead, he was sitting on the edge of the wooden platform, staring blankly at his expensive Italian leather shoes. He looked completely pathetic. A 39-year-old corporate vice president reduced to a trembling and broken child. When he realized we were completely alone, the tears finally started. It was not quiet or dignified crying. It was the loud and messy weeping of a coward who had finally been backed into a corner with absolutely no escape. He slid off the stage and fell to his knees on the cold marble floor. He crawled toward me, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my trousers. "Dad, please," Derek sobbed, his voice echoing pathetically in the massive empty room. "Please, listen to me. I am so sorry. You have to believe me. I never wanted any of this. It was Chloe. It was all her idea. She pushed me, Dad. She found out about the gambling debts and she went completely crazy. She said if I did not find a way to get the cash immediately, she would leave me. She would tell everyone at the country club that I was a failure. She brought in the fake doctor. She hired the forger. I was just terrified of losing my life. I was just trying to keep my marriage together. I looked down at him feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, no parental instinct to reach down and comfort him. I felt just a profound and chilling emptiness. He was a man who refused to take accountability for a single decision in his entire life. He was throwing his wife under the bus the exact same way his arrogant father-in-law had thrown her under the bus just 20 minutes ago. They were all exactly the same. Parasites wearing expensive suits. "You cannot throw me out on the street," Dad Derek pleaded, looking up at me with red and swollen eyes. "I am your son. I am your flesh and blood. We are family. You and Mom raised me better than this. I made a mistake, a massive, horrible mistake, but I am still your boy. Please do not take the house away from me. Do not leave me with nothing. Give me one more chance. Mom would not want you to do this to me." Hearing him say Vivian's name was the final lock snapping shut on his fate. I took a slow and deliberate step back, forcing his hands to fall away from my clothes. "Do not ever let your mother's name cross your lips again," I said. My voice was a low and dangerous rumble that vibrated through the silent room. "You gave up the right to speak her name the second you forged my signature on a deed to sell her sacred land to a commercial developer. You gave up the right to call yourself my son the second you agreed to lock me in a state psychiatric ward just so you could pay off your pathetic sports betting debts. You say Chloe made you do it? I continued staring down at him with eyes burning with cold and absolute judgment. You say you were just trying to keep your marriage together. You are not a victim, Derek. You are a volunteer. You stood in the dining room and toasted with her racist parents about throwing me into a facility. You stole directly from my trust accounts. You watched your wife humiliate me, treat me like a stray dog, and banish me to a windowless laundry room in a house that I paid for. And you did absolutely nothing. A real man stands up for his family. You just stood back and calculated exactly how much money you could make off my corpse. You think because we share blood I owe you endless forgiveness, I said, my tone dropping to absolute ice. Blood just means we are related by biology. Loyalty is what makes a family. Respect is what makes a family. You have demonstrated neither. I spent 40 years breaking my back on dangerous construction sites in the freezing Chicago winters to give you the world. I paid for your elite university education. I bought this mansion in secret to protect your fragile ego. And you used my sacrifices to fund a miserable life of lies and ultimate betrayal. Derek just wept, burying his face in his hands, realizing that his emotional manipulation was completely useless. The tears of a manipulator mean nothing when the audience finally knows the truth. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tuxedo jacket. I pulled out a single and dull brass key attached to a cheap plastic ring. It looked entirely out of place in this $2 million mansion. I tossed it through the air. The key hit the marble floor right in front of Derek's knees with a sharp and high-pitched clatter. He flinched, staring down at it through his tears. "Pick it up," I ordered. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the key. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely working. "This is your new reality," I told him. That key opens the door to a one-bedroom apartment in a run-down building on the far south side of the city. It has a bare mattress on the floor, a leaky kitchen faucet, and absolutely zero luxury. I paid the rent for exactly 30 days. The electricity is turned on, but there is no internet, no cable television, and absolutely no platinum credit cards waiting for you in the mailbox. Derek looked at the key and then up at me, his face twisted in pure horror. "I cannot live there," he gasped, shaking his head frantically. "It is dangerous. It is a slum. I have nothing, Dad. I have no money for food. I will lose my vice president job when they see my credit score." "That sounds like a problem you need to solve," I replied, buttoning my suit jacket with total calm. "You wanted to play the role of a self-made titan of industry. Now you get to actually try being one. You have 30 days to find a way to eat, pay your own rent, and figure out how to survive in the real world without a safety net." I turned my back on him and started walking toward the grand staircase. I had a master bedroom upstairs with a panoramic view of the city, and I fully intended to sleep in it tonight. "Dad, wait!" he cried out, his voice cracking with sheer desperation as he scrambled to his feet. "What am I supposed to do? Please do not leave me like this." I did not stop walking. I did not look back. I placed my foot on the first marble step and looked straight ahead. "You are going to start over from scratch," I said, my voice echoing down the grand hallway with a cold and absolute finality. "And you are going to do it completely alone, because I am officially done saving you. 2 months is a very short time in the eyes of the law, but it is an absolute eternity when you are falling from a very high pedestal." The air inside the Cook County Courthouse was stale and cold. It was a massive difference from the fragrant floral arrangements and expensive perfumes of Chloe's ruined charity gala. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing a sharp charcoal suit, resting my hands on the polished wooden railing. I watched my former daughter-in-law take the witness stand. Chloe Sterling looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant queen who had snatched the television remote from my hands. Her expensive designer gowns were gone, completely replaced by a cheap and conservative beige blouse she probably bought at a discount store. Her hair was pulled back tightly into a plain knot. Her face was pale and entirely devoid of the expensive makeup she used to wear like armor. She was currently employing the oldest and most pathetic defense strategy in the entire legal playbook. She was playing the helpless and naive victim. Her defense attorney was a tired-looking public defender because her parents could no longer afford private counsel. He guided her through a heavily rehearsed sob story. Chloe wept openly on the witness stand, clutching a white tissue with trembling hands. She pointed her finger directly at my son Derek, who was sitting at the defense table looking like a hollow shell of a human being. She told the judge that she had absolutely no idea about the forged power of attorney. She claimed Derek was a terrifying gambling addict who controlled every single aspect of their finances. She swore under oath that hiring the fake doctor was entirely Derek's idea, and that she had just been blindly following her husband's orders because she was physically afraid of him. "I was just a devoted wife," she sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes. "I trusted my husband. I thought we were getting my father-in-law legitimate medical help. I had no idea Derek was planning to steal the land. He lied to me just like he lied to everyone else. It was a masterful performance. If I had not been living in that cramped laundry room for 3 years watching her operate, I almost would have believed her." Derek just stared at the floor, taking the ultimate betrayal without a single word of protest. They were turning on each other like starving rats trapped in a cage. But a lie, no matter how beautifully it is dressed up, can never survive a head-on collision with the absolute truth. The prosecutor was a sharp and relentless woman. She called me to the stand. I walked up the wooden steps, taking my seat and looking directly at the judge. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger. I simply presented the concrete foundation of my evidence. "Mr. Rollins," the prosecutor asked, "did your daughter-in-law know that the doctor evaluating you was a complete fraud?" I did not answer with words. I answered with the small black pen I had carried in my faded flannel shirt. The prosecutor submitted the digital audio file into evidence and played it directly through the courtroom speakers. The crisp, high-definition audio filled the sterile room. Every single person in the gallery heard Chloe's voice. It was not the weak and trembling voice she had just used on the witness stand. It was the sharp, arrogant, and commanding tone she used when she thought she was entirely untouchable. "Here is the rest of the payment." The recording of Chloe echoed off the wood-paneled walls. $5,000 in cash, just like we agreed. "You will have the signed medical evaluation delivered to me by tomorrow morning, right?" the fake doctor confirmed on the tape. Then Chloe's voice cut through the air again, vicious and highly calculated. "Just make sure it is backdated. And remember, if anyone ever asks, you have been treating him for the past 6 months." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The judge was a stern man with zero tolerance for perjury. He slowly took off his glasses and glared down at Chloe. Her fake tears stopped instantly. The white tissue fell from her trembling hands, hitting the floor. The sympathetic mask completely melted off her face, revealing the cold and calculating predator hiding underneath. She was completely and utterly trapped. There was no blaming Derek for this. It was her voice. It was her money. It was her absolute and undeniable guilt. The sentencing was swift and completely merciless. The judge did not hold back. He looked at Chloe and Derek with profound disgust. He called their actions a despicable and coordinated assault on a vulnerable family member fueled entirely by unchecked greed. Derek was handed a severe sentence for wire fraud and forging legal documents, ensuring he would spend the next several years in a federal penitentiary. But Chloe was handed a sentence designed to completely shatter her massive ego. Because she was a first-time offender, the judge sentenced her to 3 years of strict probation. But the real punishment was the mandated community service. The judge ordered 1,000 hours of hard manual labor at a state-run sanitation facility. The arrogant woman who was terrified of letting her wealthy friends see a black man in her house was now legally forced to wear a bright orange safety vest and pick up rotting garbage on the side of the Chicago highways for the next 3 years. And she had absolutely no safety net to fall back on. Her arrogant parents, Richard and Susan Sterling, had experienced their own absolute and terrifying destruction. Just as I promised, the Internal Revenue Service had descended on Richard's car dealership empire like a pack of starving wolves. The federal audit uncovered decades of aggressive tax evasion, hidden offshore accounts, and massive corporate fraud. Federal agents had raided their pristine suburban estate. The government seized their luxury cars, their expensive boats, and completely froze every single one of their bank accounts. The great Sterling family. The people who thought they were royalty was now living in a cheap weekly motel on the outskirts of the city, completely bankrupt and facing their own looming federal indictments. They did not even show up to the courthouse to support their daughter because they could not afford the gas money to get there. The gavel banged loudly against the wooden block, echoing through the room. The court was officially adjourned. I walked out of the courtroom feeling a profound sense of absolute closure. The heavy air of the courthouse hallway was a stark contrast to the massive weight that had finally been lifted off my shoulders. I stood near the heavy glass exit doors adjusting the cuffs of my tailored suit jacket. A few moments later, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom pushed open. Chloe walked out. She was flanked by her public defender looking completely broken. She had no money, no home, no husband, and absolutely zero status. She was just a convicted fraudster with 1,000 hours of highway garbage collection waiting for her. She stopped walking when she saw me standing by the exit. We locked eyes. There was no screaming. There were no arrogant threats or throwing of tantrums. Her eyes were completely hollowed out, but deep inside them I could see the burning embers of pure humiliation and bitter hatred. She wanted to say something. She wanted to hurl one last desperate insult to salvage a single ounce of her shattered pride. But she could not. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. The reality of her total destruction choked the words right out of her throat. She lowered her head, unable to maintain eye contact with the man she had so foolishly underestimated. She could no longer look me in the eye. The queen had lost her crown and her voice. She tucked her chin to her chest and shuffled past me, pushing through the heavy glass doors and stepping out into the cold and unforgiving reality of the city streets. The winter wind howled outside the thick glass windows of the mansion, but inside the air was perfectly still and profoundly warm. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, my leather slippers moving softly over the pristine marble floors. The house felt completely different now. The heavy, suffocating energy of fake wealth and constant anxiety had been completely scrubbed from the walls. Chloe's sterile modern art pieces, the ones that looked like spilled paint and cost more than a reliable car, were gone. I had them taken down and donated to a local charity auction. In their place, I hung framed photographs of my late wife, Vivian. I hung the original blueprints of the first commercial high-rise my electrical contracting company ever wired. I filled the space with things that actually possessed soul history and undeniable truth. I walked past the hallway that led to the laundry room. The door to that cramped, windowless box was wide open. I used it to store cleaning supplies now, which was exactly what it was built for. I no longer had to shrink myself to fit into the dark corners of my own property. I no longer had to mask my strength or hide my intelligence just to appease a cowardly son and his deeply prejudiced wife. I made my way into the massive open-concept kitchen. The marble countertops gleamed under the warm pendant lights. I opened the custom oak liquor cabinet and pulled out a bottle of 20-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon. It was a rare batch, a gift from a real estate developer I had done business with decades ago. I poured 2 fingers of the amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. I did not add ice. I did not need anything to dilute the absolute perfection of the moment. Carrying my glass, I walked into the main living room. The space was completely transformed. Chloe's uncomfortable white sofas were gone, replaced by rich, deep brown leather armchairs that you could actually sink into. The room finally felt like a home instead of a staged photograph in a pretentious lifestyle magazine. I sat down in the center armchair. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bourbon. The liquid burned pleasantly as it went down, warming my chest. I set the glass down on the solid wood coffee table and reached for the television remote. It was the exact same remote Chloe had violently snatched out of my hands on that very first night. I pressed the power button. The massive flat-screen television mounted above the stone fireplace instantly hummed to life. The high-definition speakers clicked on. I navigated through the menus and pulled up the exact same live recording of the 1970s jazz concert. The smooth, deep sound of the upright bass began to play, followed by the sharp and soulful cry of a tenor saxophone. The music flooded the massive living room, wrapping around the columns and echoing up the grand staircase. It was loud. It was unapologetic. It was absolutely beautiful. I leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands on the armrests. I watched the musicians on the screen pouring their hearts into their instruments. I waited for a moment out of sheer habit. I waited to hear the sharp, aggressive click of designer heels storming down the hardwood hallway. I waited for a shrill voice to scream about the aesthetic of the room being ruined. I waited for someone to march over and shut the screen to black. But the hallway remained completely empty. The only sound in the house was the brilliant and unbothered rhythm of the jazz band. Nobody was coming to snatch the remote. Nobody was coming to tell me my culture and my joy were just noise. Because the people who called my music trash were currently learning exactly what it meant to be treated like garbage. My son Derek was officially 3 weeks into his new life on the far south side. My former lawyer Arthur Vance had kept tabs on him just to ensure he did not violate the restraining orders. Derek was working a grueling entry-level job at a logistics warehouse making a fraction of his former salary. He was taking the public bus at 5 in the morning. He was eating cheap canned food in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaky ceiling and a radiator that barely worked. Part of me, the part that had held him as a newborn baby, felt a tiny, microscopic sliver of sorrow. But the man who survived the brutal streets of Chicago and built an empire knew that pain is the ultimate teacher. I spent my entire life shielding Derek from the cold, ensuring he never had to struggle the way I did. I thought I was protecting him, but I was only making him incredibly weak. I was raising a soft man who did not know how to defend his own blood. If Derek was ever going to become a real man, he had to learn how to survive in the absolute dirt. He had to rebuild his own foundation from the ground up without my money, without my house, and without my protection. Maybe he would figure it out. Maybe he would finally grow a spine and earn his way back into the light. Or maybe he would collapse under the weight of his own profound mediocrity. That was entirely up to him now. My shift as his savior was permanently over. And as for Vivian's land, the beautiful 10 acres of ancient oak trees out in the suburbs, it was entirely safe. I had officially transferred the deed into an ironclad, irrevocable trust dedicated to environmental preservation. No commercial developer would ever touch it. No bulldozers would ever pave over her sanctuary to build a concrete shopping center. Her memory would remain undisturbed, a quiet and peaceful testament to the love we shared. I picked up my crystal glass and took another slow sip of the aged bourbon. The saxophone hit a high, triumphant note that resonated through the floorboards. I closed my eyes, letting the music wash over me completely. For 3 years, I played the role of a silent victim. I let them believe I was a fragile, decaying shadow of a man waiting to be swept under the rug. I let them spin their web of lies and medical fraud, thinking they were the apex predators in the room. But a tiger does not stop being a tiger just because it closes its eyes to rest. I opened my eyes and looked around the vast, empty, and beautifully peaceful mansion. The air was clean. The silence between the musical notes was golden. I was 71 years old, and I had successfully navigated the most dangerous betrayal of my entire life. I had burned the infection out at the root. I took a deep breath. There was no more manipulation. There was no more fake high society posturing. There were no more parasites feeding off my 40 years of hard labor. The throne was officially reclaimed, and my life was finally completely free of trash. Respect is not a currency you can buy, and kindness is never an invitation for exploitation. When you mistake an old man's silence for weakness, you fail to realize that the quietest storms leave the most devastating destruction. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. If you choose to treat the hands that fed you as a stepping stone for your greed, do not be surprised when those same hands pull the ground from beneath your feet. Build your own empire, or the borrowed throne you sit on will eventually become your cage. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Let me know in the comments below, have you ever had to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace? Until next time, remember your worth and never let anyone silence your music.